Welcome back to the Exhaust Note podcast. I'm Brynn, and that is James Elliott, the director of Octane Magazine.
I wish I was director, just editor-in-chief, but thank you very much for having me on.
So, you have been in this industry for 30 years. What have you seen that has changed the most in that time?
Everything in short. When I got into it, sort of classic cars were much more of a niche hobby. It was far less accessible. You had to make much more effort to get into it. It was cheaper to get into, but if that was your thing, it was quite easy. But I don't think that you had so many casual fans who could sort of not have it rule their lives. For me and my friends, it was our whole lives was the classic cars, and we went to this, that, and the other. But I think one of the things that has changed is that Goodwood revival. Now, I this may be, you could credit other events in other countries, but certainly the ripple effects of the Goodwood revival have been felt, and that started in 1998. And this is when Lord March, or Duke of Richmond as he is now, reopened the motor circuit down at Goodwood House in Sussex, and started holding a historic race festival where everything was, all the cars and all the styles and everything were pre 1966, which was when the circuit originally closed, which had started post-war. And this event really attracted a whole different audience and crowd of people who perhaps weren't as engaged with the classic car world previously, and they would come down and they'd dress up and they'd enjoy it and they would get interested. And a lot of those people have gone on to sort of buy cars, whether it's just to load up a Mark II Jag with their friends and go to Goodwood once a year, or whether a lot of those people have ended up historic racing themselves. But in terms of the people it brought in, and then the knock-on effects it's had in other events starting up that are similar. There are so many events now compared with 30 years ago. You had 4 or 5 big concours and 4 or 5 big racing festivals. And that was pretty much it. Everything else was very grassroots. And now there's huge events all over the world, all the time. And that is absolutely fantastic. But also, this has had another knock-on effect, which is the breadth of ownership growing so much has massively affected the quality and stock of classic cars that are out there. In that 30 years ago, a lot more of them were towards the end of their lives or sort of restored to be kept going, rather than very few of them received the sort of restoration that concours cars and so many others receive now, which is that people pay good money to completely rebuild a car so that it can, with continued maintenance and further rebuilds down the line, basically last forever. So if a car has survived this long, because of the change in attitude brought about by the larger interest in the hobby, and yeah, there are lifestyle elements of that, then there's no reason why all the cars that currently exist shouldn't exist forever, as long as sort of legislation is kind to us. And this, of course, also had a knock on values, in that 30 years ago, you could buy a Ferrari Daytona or a Lamborghini Miura for about 60, 70,000 pounds. And obviously those are sort of multiplied tenfold plus since then. And, things like Toyota 2000 GTs or Mercedes 300 SL Gullwings, these were all the sort of price you'd expect to pay for a Jaguar E-Type now. And yet these cars are sort of the halo cars, worth an absolute fortune. And that also is because a lot of people have spent a lot of money, in many cases, restoring them. The 60 or 70,000 pound Miura you might have been able to buy, if you had bought it for 60 or 70,000 pounds, would have probably cost you several times that since then, in order to sort of keep running it and get it into an acceptable condition for today. So, it's great. I love looking back at old magazines and at the price guides and saying, oh, I could have had this or I could have had that. But the truth is, somebody like me may have been able to buy it back then, but I wouldn't have been able to afford to keep it in good condition.
Is there a coolest person that you've gotten to meet at all these events that you've been to?
Oh gosh, so many cool people. Let me think. One of our columnists for Octane Magazine, Derek Bell, is especially cool. He is a very laid back and great guy. You can still see a little bit of steely-eyed competition in him there. There are so many cool people. I'll tell you, everyone who's lent me a car so my job is I go along and people lend me their cars and encourage me to drive their cars in order to put them in the magazine, and that's absolutely fantastic. I mean, again, 30 years ago it may have been a bit easier when a short wheelbase or something was, well, maybe I insured one in 2000 for probably £500,000, and that obviously is tiny compared with its value now. But to lend somebody a car of that value then and just say go off and enjoy it was astonishing. And the fact that people still do, it continues to be astonishing. I mean, the main priority of my role is to bring it back in the same condition that it's loaned to me, and not break things. That's kind of the number one thing.
Based on your experience, do you have any cars that you think are going to increase in value relatively soon?
Well, our latest issue, which this was not a planned plug whatsoever, was it? I just had to have our latest issue, which is 1990s Best Buys. And the reason we've done that is because the 1990s are super hot at the moment. All the cars from the 1990s, some have already risen to, I think, the point where if there are any more significant gains to be had, they're going to be very marginal. But the 1990s was this amazing era for cars. It was sort of like the death throes of analog before sort of everything became a bit too computerized and a bit too automated. And it's almost like the engineers knew that, and they just came out with this slew of fantastic cars. Everything had a performance version, whether it was the smallest hot hatch Clio up to sort of the most, even estate cars had these astonishing high performance versions, and limited editions were everywhere. And there was, the 1980s had some amazing cars, and the 1970s too. If you think the 1970s, you'd sort of, the Golf came out in the middle of the 19th, or the Rabbit, depending on where you are, came out in the middle of the 1970s, and then you get the Quattro and the Integrale, and you get these benchmark cars. But the 1990s is just awash with fantastic cars, whatever your budget, whatever your interest, whether it's hot hatches, saloons, icons, supercars. There were so many superb options in the 1990s, and a lot of them are still really affordable now. So I would say go and buy the magazine, but at the moment, if you want something that's going to rise in value, you should be looking at 1990s cars, the ones that haven't already gone. Though that's where the interest is at the moment, and the interest is there for many reasons. One of them being that there are so many really interesting and effective and good cars there, and also the sort of the last throes of analog, where there are proper driver's cars, where you are in charge of the car rather than car in charge of you. And that's one of the things that appeals to people, I think. And also it's generationally, the people who loved those cars when they were kids and they had sort of posters of those or read magazines about those, and they were, that was their dream car. Then they're now of an age where they've probably got a bit of spare money to invest in living that dream later in life. And so for all sorts of reasons, 1990s, that's where it's at.
You've owned quite a few cars. What has been the most challenging one to work on for maintenance?
They're all challenging in different ways. Rust is the biggest enemy of cars in the UK. And although I used to weld when I was a kid with a little bit of oxyacetylene gas, I haven't done since then, and I probably should need to learn how to weld with MIG or one of the more modern systems and deal with rust, because as long as you're in the UK, rust is going to be a challenge, whatever your car is. Even if you've got glass fiber cars, like I've had a lot of Lotuses and they've been glass fiber with a backbone chassis, the chassis is metal, and that will rust. Lotuses are often quite difficult to work on because they're very small. I mean, as a car, it's actually a lot more simple than people think. A lot of people are scared of them and think that they're very tricky. There are some jobs. If you want to do a water pump on one of the little baby Lotus Elans, it's easier to take the engine out, and so you're looking at sort of quite a lot of hours to do a water pump change, which on my Triumph is a 15-minute job, and that's if you spend 5 minutes just staring at it. But so they can be quite tricky, but it's not that complicated car. The biggest issue with that is everything's very compact and in a small space, and so you need small, agile hands to get to everything. Rust and space are the biggest issues, I guess. In terms of complication, most of my cars have been quite simple. I mean, the most complicated I had was the Lancia Delta Integrale. That was not the first generation 8-valve. It was second generation 16-valve car. Absolutely astonishing car to drive. Drank petrol like nothing on earth. This thing drank more petrol than a Cobra. It was unbelievable. But, you know, rally legend, fantastic to drive, real head turner, because they weren't sold new in the UK. They were left-hand drive only, and so a real sort of cognoscenti car. You got thumbs up from all the right people. It was a really feel-good car. But I bought mine as a company car, which, I mean, I don't know how the system works there, but at the time in the UK, I was given an allowance to spend on a car, and the traditional thing was to go out and buy a brand new Peugeot 306, which was about the same value at the time as a second-hand Integrale, and I persuaded my boss, and my boss was very supportive, that rather than spend that amount of money on a brand new Peugeot 306, we should go and spend all that money on a lovely Lancia Delta Integrale, and that would be good marketing for the brand. And so we did, and we went and bought this car, and it was absolutely fantastic until the first major service, at which point they realized the difference between a brand new Peugeot 306 and Lancia Delta Integrale was a massive service bill. And so the accountants at the company ended our fun after only a year, but it was a fantastic year. That was a complicated car.
What is your favorite thing that you've ever got to drive?
It depends what I'm boasting about. I've driven both generations of Ferrari GTO, 250 GTO, and a 288 GTO. So I've done all right on that front. I've ticked some big boxes there. F40, F50. A lot of the sort of Ferraris that people lust after, I've driven in the course of my work, which makes me very fortunate. Short wheelbase as well, which is a benchmark car. In terms of boasting, probably the Monteverde High would be the number one, simply because so few people have driven it. This was a bespoke Swiss supercar with a mid-mounted, huge Chrysler Mopar engine, which is practically under your elbow, and not sophisticatedly hidden. It's basically a bit of carpet over it, maybe with cardboard box. And there were very few of these cars made, 2, maybe 3. And even fewer people have driven them, and I was very lucky to do one. The circumstances of driving it, ruin the good story, in that they were largely for photography around a car park. But I can still turn up to events and say to all the other motoring journalists, of course, that time I drove the Monteverde High, and very few of them can say that they've done the same. So that's probably the best one for boasting. The best memory was when I was with a former magazine, when I was very young and still new to it. We rented a little sprint track called Kerbro in the UK, and we got 10 great drivers' cars, and we got them up there for the day. And we had John Surtees, a former only man sort of world champion on 4 wheels and 2, who was our track tester, and he came up and he tested all these cars, and we drove them around this track all day. And at the end of the day, most of the cars had gone home, and everyone had gone home, and we were just left waiting for one car to be picked up, which was a light-bodied Ferrari 250 GT short wheelbase Berlinetta, and it was absolutely beautiful. Perfect example. And myself and a colleague, Mick Walsh, who was a great mentor, we were left there with this car on our own, waiting for it to be picked up. And so you leave 2 guys with a perfect on-the-button example of a dream car, and a track, we had the best couple of hours. Well, I had the best couple of hours driving that I think I've ever had, and it wasn't. It was the whole circumstances of it. It was a summer's evening, and the sun was just going down. It was just absolute perfection, and so that memory will live with me forever.
Do you have a favorite place that you've gotten to drive?
Probably. I mean, the most obviously a favorite place to drive is that varies as well. I mean, you can have a lot more fun on a track. So most tracks are going to win. And in the UK, the track I've driven most is one called Castle Combe. And I've done more miles there than any other, and I love that. But I do remember an occasion where I had to be waved off Donington Park because I was enjoying it so much that they were sort of telling me to come in, and I was going round and round and round there, and I just didn't want to stop. It was just, I was in a Lotus doing that, and Lotus is by far a less than ideal car for that track because it's a real power circuit and it's a big circuit, and probably a sort of hottie type would have done it a lot better. But I was doing it in the land, and I seemed to have lots of space, and I had huge fun. And they had to wave me off there. Cadwell Park is another small track. It's called the Mini Nürburgring. Nürburgring actually is somewhere I've never driven, which is a real omission on my part. Laguna Seca, that's pretty stunning. I haven't done a lot there, but I have driven around it, probably quite slowly because if you're uneducated in it, it's quite a terrifying place to drive. But then there's other places, like there's a circuit in Paris. Well, it was outside Paris, but it's hard to tell what the city stops nowadays. And called Montlhéry, and there is, you can drive what's left of the circuit there, and that was a banked circuit, and so that's pretty thrilling because that's got the real atmospherics and the history. Or we used to seek out old road circuits, like you can go to Rouen in France, and you can work out where the old Grand Prix circuit is, and you can drive around that, and it's all on public roads, and so that's pretty good. But there's a lot of, like everyone, I've got my favorite roads. There's a bit of road on the Welsh borders coming down to Bristol, which is just a fast, what we call an A road. So it's only sort of one lane on each side. It's not a dual carriageway or anything. It's one lane on each side, but it's undulating and it's long sweeping corners, and you can just really get and maintain a high speed. It's not the sort of low gear tight corners and switchbacks and hairpins and things like that. It's the other type of driving where it would be perfect in a V8 GT, and you know just sort of get it into sort of play it between third and fourth gear and just keep it rolling the whole way. It's a real sort of momentum road, and that's absolutely beautiful. But then, as you say, I've driven, we're very lucky. The Alps are just on the other side of France, and we've driven quite a few Alpine passes as well. And that way, that is the opposite. That is where you can be doing switchbacks and everything sort of in second and third gear instead, and in sort of coming out in a lot. And if you've got a clear road and the right car, anywhere can be amazing, really.
James and I had a great time talking, and a part 2 of this episode will be releasing in the coming weeks. Stay tuned.